On February 16, 2022, Getsu Fumiden Undying Moon was released to the Steam platform, the sequel to the late 80s Japan exclusive, Getsu Fumiden. This game tries to combine an interesting art style with deep, meaningful gameplay. Does it succeed, or will this game perish in the depths of hell? My name's Yuo, and there's only one way to find out. Warning, there will be spoilers ahead. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Getsu Fumiden Undying Moon is a hack-and-slash roguelike published by Konami and developed by Konami and Guru Guru. The shining achievement of this game is the art style. Inspired by the ukiyo-e art style, the creations most people think of regarding old Japanese art. The visuals are truly stunning and set it apart from the majority of roguelike games. From the effects that radiate off your weapons during attacks, to the still frames before boss battles, this game is a pleasure for the eyes. The game has two characters to play as, Getsu Fuma and Getsu Renge. You start the game as Getsu Fuma. After finishing the game on the commoner difficulty, all higher levels of difficulty have an RNG chance of spawning a Getsu Renge boss fight. Defeating her once will unlock her as a playable character. There is not much difference between the two, although she does have her own talents you need to relevel. If you have played any of the modern roguelikes, for example Hades or Dead Cells, you know what to expect here. There are some things the game attempts differently, and this is where we run into the first problems Getsu Fumiden has. The game mechanics are not explained well. A big part of the gameplay initially is retiring your run after boss fights. Until you unlock certain skills, you lose everything on death. You will most likely waste some time like I did, restarting from or near zero over and over before realizing you should end your run early to start banking rewards. Another mechanic not explained well is Soul Devour. I played the game for 8 hours before figuring out what Soul Devour does and what the hotkey for it is. Although, this did make me a better player as I was progressing while ignoring this vital mechanic. The game's weapon system allows the player to run 2 primary weapons and 2 sub-weapons. From gauntlets to swords, spears, and even umbrellas, the game has a variety of weapons. While each class of weapon plays differently from the other, there are no unique weapons within each class that offer something drastically different from the others. For example, the Bloodthirsty Blade, which is the most expensive katana to unlock, is going to play similarly to the default one. The main difference is that each weapon has its own skill tree of passives, which might influence you to get sub-weapons that complement your primary one. The movesets stay the same across each class though. The next problem is the boss fights. The game does a good job of crafting cool looking bosses that you want to fight. From a giant skeleton and giant spider to a giant space squid, there's a lot of variety here for the bosses, although most of them will be giant. Unfortunately, most of the bosses are pushovers. The break mechanic is like a stun effect that allows the player to execute stunned enemies, which kills all regular enemies and deals large amounts of damage to bosses. This mechanic trivializes most boss battles until you reach the hardest difficulty in the game, the Devotee. Even then, on the hardest difficulty, the first boss routinely dies before he gets to attack, or gets only one attack off before dying. And that's not unique to him either. Every boss with multiple HP bars, like the Sea Dragon or the Nine-Tailed Fox, suffers from this. Every boss under the Devotee difficulty, which again is the hardest difficulty in the game, either melts like butter or gets stun locked to death, with the only exception being the giant yokai. The final boss in the game, the super cool giant controlling giant space squid, got absolutely murdered on every difficulty under Devotee. It's a shame the balance around the boss fights is off, because the art team really knocked it out of the park here. There's a lot of variety when it comes to zone aesthetics. From the fiery depths of hell to misty mountains with eyeballs watching you, and a pleasure district full of mole rats, just to name a few. The zones are enjoyable to visit and play through. Higher difficulty levels increase enemy variety for each zone, which helps reduce the repetitiveness of clearing the zones over and over again. Speaking of enemy variety, you have the typical skeletons, puddles of water, ogres, birds, flying lion masks, demonic masks, and more. Again, the variety here is appreciated. The game has 5 levels of difficulty. It took me 10 hours to beat the easiest difficulty twice, one of which was accidental, and the second easiest. After that, I took 3 additional hours to beat the next 2 difficulties. I finally clocked out of the game at 20 hours played. The game was most enjoyable during that 3 hours in the middle. The first 2 difficulties have you leaving runs early to bank rewards, and clearing the same few repetitive zones over and over until you're strong enough to beat the game. The next 2 difficulties adds additional enemy variety that makes those early zones more enjoyable to replay, and has a nice balance of difficulty and enjoyment. Like I said previously, the bosses are still pushovers, but the main gameplay of clearing zones is enjoyable. Devotee is where the bullshittery that happens in this game gets amplified. Now that the damage is so much higher, the attacks from off screen, the enemies that are stacked on top of each other that you can't see, really starts draining the enjoyment of the game. Coming out of a room just to be gangbanged by a group of enemies that will deplete your whole health bar is not enjoyable. I spent 7 hours on this difficulty, and most runs felt like bullshit happened. The worst part is the difficulty doesn't even make the bosses more enjoyable. Now the Nine-Tailed Fox can get off one attack before being killed. The balance for bosses is still way off. I feel especially bad for the first boss in the game. I saw him attack during the initial playthroughs when I was at my weakest. I did not see any of his attacks on the difficulties afterwards, and now on the hardest, he's lucky to get even one attack off before being mowed down. There's not much of a story here. I don't mean like in other games where you find journals or lore tidbits and have to piece it together yourself. I mean there's almost nothing here at all. Outside of a bestiary, weapons viewer, and these rocks with very brief journal entries, you get a cutscene about how the gates of hell have opened up and you must close them. You then go on killing different bosses until finally reaching your brother. He starts vaguely talking about how it's his duty to pull the sword. None of this matters, of course. If you're playing on the easiest difficulty, you beat him and he says gotta go and just leaves. If you're playing on the harder difficulties, you beat him, go into the real final zone, fight the giant squid. The game zooms into a television screen with meteors or other giant squids seemingly crashing out of the sky. Cut to black. That's the story. Now, this may seem like sequel or DLC bait, but that's looking unlikely. The game's last hotfix patch was in May of 2022. Since then, radio silence. The devs have not posted on the game's Twitter since April 2022. A roadmap is released on the 26th of April 2021, before the official Steam Early Access launch. Some of the things in the Beyond section, like new characters, have yet to release, so development might be officially done. Is Getsu Fumaden Undying Moon the next genre-defining title? It's not. However, if you can find it on sale, the game is easily worth it for the aesthetic alone. It also helps that the game is really enjoyable where I think the average player will stop playing, around that 3rd and 4th difficulty level. Devotee was added in the first and only non-hotfix patch a month after launch, which may be why the balance around it is not great, but that's just a guess. If you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate it if you subscribed. It really helps the channel grow. If you have played Getsu Fumaden Undying Moon, leave a comment on how you feel about it. That's all for me. Hope to see you next time. Yuo out.